What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. Since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you ideological ingredients so you can brew your own faith. And today on the podcast, we have a return guest, the one and only Keith Ward. That's right, Keith Ward, philosopher of religion, theologian extraordinaire. He's been Dean of Trinity Hall, Cambridge, Regius Professor of Divinity at Oxford, a Fellow of the British Academy. He's right now at Roehampton University in London. And we're going to be talking about his brand new book, Sharing in the Divine Nature, a Personalist Metaphysic. Ooh, yeah. Well, we have a bunch of fun in this conversation. And if you're new to Homebrewed and you haven't listened to all the previous times Keith has been on the podcast, just go to the website, tripfuller.com with 2 P's, and you can see links to all his previous visits. If you are sitting there listening to this as it goes out in the month of October 2020 and want some online solidarity during the election season, go to ruiningdinner.com and you can hang out with Diana Butler-Bast, myself, and a number of friends as we have little moments of solidarity, insight. And the greatest thing is Diana, who is an exceptional communicator and public scholar, also a church historian of American religion. She's helping us process and set things in context, and you can join up. It's a lot of fun. ruiningdinner.com. Now, before we jump in to this episode, I want to give mad shout-outs, props across the interwebs to everyone that's a part of the Homebrewed community. All those cool cats that went to homebrewedcommunity.com, they signed up. They don't just donate each month to make this whole thing possible. You know, the less than 1% of you that do that, they're amazing. But they also get access to the private Facebook group of all your theology nerd friends. They also get access to very special private members-only podcast feed with hundreds of episodes in it just for you, like all the audio from a bunch of classes. They're there. Lectures I give, all sorts of exciting things. They're just right there. They went to homebrewedcommunity.com to make this podcast possible. I just want to give props to them. Oh, yeah. Also, Lakers won. Championship. That's amazing. Now, this week's episode is sponsored by my friends at Interfaith Power and Light. You know, not a week goes by without getting into some conversation about the environmental impact that humans are having on God's creation. It could be in the classroom, in a congregation, at a pub, on Zoom with friends. The talks I have really run the range of emotions. And on the pessimistic side, we can see almost daily reminders of the devastation that environmental pollution has wreaked on our water, air, climate. And frankly, it can be pretty dispiriting. But on the positive side, there are folks all across the U.S. that are taking action right now to protect the world we've been given. I'm taking the pledge to vote to protect our climate this year. I think it would be great if you join me. So just go to faithclimatejusticevoter.org to find out more. And this whole initiative is part of a partnership with Interfaith Power and Light. I've been a supporter of them for years. The man I started this podcast with, Chad Crawford, was an employee there for the first few years of the podcast. So go check it out. Go to faithclimatejusticevoter.org. Take the pledge. Let your friends know that climate justice is on the ballot, and vote for your imaginary great-grandkids. All right? Here's Keith Ward. Enjoy. Well, hello, everybody. This is Trip, and a return guest, friend of the podcast, Keith Ward, is back on, and we're talking about his new book, Sharing in the Divine Nature, a Personalist Metaphysic. It's not only, peak Keith Ward, it's engaging a whole host of contemporary theologians and making a clear and engaging argument. The only problem is I enjoyed it too much that it might just come across like I'm a fanboy asking Keith to give me the greatest hits of a book I just read. But anyway, thank you so much for coming, Keith.
Pleasure.
So was one of your last books. You keep saying you're going to write a last book.
I know, I'm writing another one now. It's definitely the last.
And this book is engaging, developing your own particular metaphysics. So maybe before jumping in, how would you frame the conversation among philosophical theologians today when the question of metaphysics arises? Like, what are the different ways you see that question being handled before kind of digging into your particular perspective?
Right. I think in the UK, at least, a lot of theologians still think that metaphysics isn't possible, that it's somehow dead, and you have to talk in terms of literary narrative without making any claims about objective reality. So that's still kind of fashionable view, and I'm completely opposed to that, I have to say. I think that I just call metaphysics in a very simple way. I mean, there are many definitions of the word metaphysics, but I just think it's trying to decide what is ultimately real, what sorts of things exist. I mean, is there a mind as the ultimate reality, or is materialism the ultimate truth, as some philosophically minded scientists try to tell us? So I do think, and I thought before I was a Christian, that the basic philosophical question is the universe more mind-like and purposive and valuable, or is it more materialistic and chance accidental, and consciousness is a sort of just superfluous and unseen phenomenon in the life of the universe? So I think metaphysics is about that question. Mm-hmm. And Christians don't have to do metaphysics at all, but I think all Christians ought to have an interest in whether the ultimate reality is God or not. So it's as simple as that. I hope that's simple.
I think that's helpful. And one of the ways it shows up in your book in a particular way is you begin by quoting 2 Corinthians 5:19, that God was in Christ reconciling the world to God's self. Now, when people think of many of the more robust metaphysical traditions in Christianity, they usually begin talking about the essence of God and the divine attributes. And there's so many topics before you get to anything particular about your own confessional tradition. So maybe you can describe what it's like to go the other way, to start with this particular element that's a confessional statement and tradition, but hear it with this type of metaphysical register.
Right. Well, I suppose I taught philosophy before I taught theology. In the course of my life, I started off as a philosopher. So I did have that general philosophical interest in metaphysics. I specialized in Immanuel Kant in my early career. So I had that sort of background. I became a Christian. I was converted to Christianity. And so that gave an experiential basis to Christian faith. And of course, I took the Bible then as very important. And since then, for the whole of my life, I've been sort of keeping the two together, and they have reinforced each other in the course of my life. So I just think that Christ is an important metaphysical concept philosophically, as well as an experiential reality that you experience, or Christians claim to experience the presence of Christ, especially in the person of Jesus. So the two don't seem to me opposed. I mean, I've never understood why some people talk about the God of the philosophers versus, the God of the Bible. I don't think that's true. I think a lot of philosophers haven't talked about the God of the Bible, but that's partly because they have a different philosophical background, and partly because they just haven't had the sort of Christian experience too.
So when you mention that contrast that shows up between those that focus on the God of the philosophers and the biblical God, one of the places or one of the tensions that shows up in that conversation is that question of personality, and your personalist metaphysics is simultaneously engaging in the philosophical conversation around ultimate reality, but from one that doesn't feel necessary to sublate an affirmation of a personal ultimate reality into some type of, ground of being or absolute mystery. Or can you describe the positive intuitions that are there for those that do want to resist that personalist affirmation, and then that constructive move to affirming it?
Well, some philosophers think personality as such is not very important. That it is, if you're a materialist, for example, just something, an accident that happens, it won't last very long, it'll be extinct. So it's not fundamentally important. I think it's important to get clear what is meant by personal, too. For me, the word personal means something is personal if it's a being which has consciousness and which has feeling, that is values, sets a value on things, knows that some things are good and some are bad, and which has, in some sense, purpose or intention or will. So if the ultimate reality is personal, then you may or may not call it God. I'm not hung up on that word particularly, but you're asking the question, is there any purpose in the universe? Does it look as though there is? I think the answer is yes, it does. And is there any value in the universe? Are some things really of ultimate value, like beauty and truth and goodness? Yes, there is. And those are philosophical answers, really. But once you put yourself in that line, you begin to say, well, if the universe is like that, then mustn't that be clear in some human history and some human experience? And that's where Christianity comes in to look for the corroboration for the theory that there is a God who has purpose and is of value and consciously intends that things should exist.
One of the challenges you pick up early in the book is the debate around whether around theological realism and anti-realism.
Yeah.
Maybe you could describe what that tension is and what do you think's up for grabs in that conversation?
Well, that's bound up with this disregard for metaphysics. When you say that there's no such thing as metaphysics, what you mean is these questions are too difficult. They're not worth going into anyway. We've got to deal with just experience as we have it and not ask about ultimate reality. That's just too grand and we can't grapple with that. So if you have that attitude, you're probably going to interpret religious talk about God and salvation and sin and so on as talk about human experiences in some way. I mean, sort of bluntly, God is a projection. It's not a real object. There's no reality out there called God. But talk about God is talk about how I value things and what my ultimate values are. Remember, Paul Tillich used to say that God is the supreme value, that and that doesn't necessarily, although Tillich was very metaphysical himself, actually, saying that God is your ultimate concern, as he did, doesn't necessarily talk about anything outside yourself. It just says that's your ultimate concern. So the non-realist, and there are lots of them around these days, and I'm friends with, my friends are non-realists, but there are people who think that it's all a matter of your own experiences. It's all subjective. It's what happens in you, and you can't really talk about reality. Now, the part about that to me is no scientist would take that seriously for a moment. If you say to a scientist, oh, well, this is just your subjective experiences, they'd say, well, that's rubbish. It's not. This is about the way the universe is. And I think that's what theologians ought to say as well. It's not just my subjective experiences. I think I experience something that really objectively exists and is more real than anything else. So, one of my great friends was John Cupid, who's quite a well-known, in England anyway, non-realist. Wittgenstein, the philosopher, was probably a great influence on that sort of thinking. And I taught in Cambridge. I taught philosophy there, and Wittgenstein was dead, of course, by then, but he was still an influence. And I think there's been quite a reaction against that in philosophical circles, of saying, well, you can talk about religious language, but you've got to say language is meant to be about reality in some sense. And if you say that, you're moving away from the subjective and a non-realist view.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of the reason that the anti-realist perspective can stick with people is that now when someone comes of age in our context, the world is so pluralistic that your encounter with God is usually mediated by a tradition that you can tell its contingent historical story, right? Like, as opposed to being born in a culture where everyone has that shared sacred canopy of sorts, where the horizon of meaning, purpose, and value kind of dissolves into the infinite. Now you can kind of sit underneath the tradition's framing narrative and receive it like you're looking at stained glass windows. But you can also go on the other side and go, that is just a bunch of weird colors, and you can't see the story on the outside of the church. And because of that tension, I think it's tempting to go, I know the experience is real on the inside when I was there, and it's a good thing, but I don't want to go into the biology lab, and if they haven't been in it, they're just seeing weird, funky colors on the window from the outside. So, like, how do you think about negotiating that kind of descriptive experience on the ground, but also want to argue metaphysically for something more robust?
Yeah. Well, I think a key case here is morality and what you think about moral claims and moral obligations. And there's a fundamental question about whether morality is just what I like, what I recommend to other people. One of my old philosophy teachers, Freddie Eyre, used to say that morality is just what you prefer, and you try to persuade other people to prefer what you prefer, and that's morality. Okay, well, the case I always think of in these cases is the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. And Sartre went on French television and said, well, I used to be, he said, an existentialist. That is, an existentialist. I make up my own values, right? There's nothing really good. I just decide to act in a certain way and recommend that to other people. And then Sartre said, but I've changed my mind. And he said, I changed my mind when I was walking along a road in Algeria, and I saw a starving child by the side of the road asking for bread. And I thought, Sartre said, as an existentialist, I can just decide whether or not to pay any attention to this. But I don't really think I can do that. This is a claim that's made on me that I can't resist. It's something outside me, which is almost forcing me to pay attention at the cost of my humanity if I don't. And so he became a non-existentialist. He changed his mind. And that's the sort of thing I think is important. You begin to think, aren't there moral demands out there in the universe to be good, to seek for understanding, to seek the truth, even if it hurts? Aren't there those moral demands, and are they just preferences that you happen to have, just an accident? You needn't have them. So once you ask that question, I can see how people might answer it in different ways. But for me, as for Sartre, it's quite clear that there is such a thing as something outside me which is demanding that I act in a certain way, or commanding, but I can ignore it if I want to. But if I do, it's at the cost of really being true to ourselves. So that would mean morality is not just about something subjective. And that's a case where it's objective, but I can't prove it to anybody. I mean, if somebody says, why shouldn't I torture children? I just say, well, are you human? Have you no sensitivity? And perhaps they say, no, not particularly, right? It doesn't matter. And so that for me is a tipping point. And religion is very like morality. The two converge quite closely, really. Okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's hopeful. And when you maybe you could describe how you understand idealism and how it's narrowed by becoming a personal idealist.
Right. Okay. Well, most people in Britain, when they do philosophy, start by studying Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. That's the great traditional English, or British, not English, British philosophers. And they start with the idea that all knowledge begins with sense experience and with human experience more generally. So you can't ever eliminate that experience. Now, that's subjective. The experience is subjective, but it tells you about an objective physical world, and nobody denied that among the philosophers. So idealism is the view that experience is the beginning of knowledge, but it's also the end of knowledge. That is to say, without experience, there wouldn't be any knowledge, and maybe that prompts the thought that without experience, there wouldn't be any reality. And actually, quantum physics gives some support. Or let me put it another way. Some quantum physicists are persuaded that in quantum physics, consciousness is a necessary part of understanding. If you don't observe a thing, it doesn't exist as you observe it at all, right? So consciousness has a real effect on what exists. So an idealist says the most important basis and starting point in knowledge is experience. So the idealistic view is that consciousness comes before physical existence. And that's the opposite of the materialist view, that first of all you've got a body and then you may or may not have a consciousness. But an idealist would say, no, consciousness comes first. It's more real. It's more self-existent than matter. In fact, we don't even know what matter is. It's really and of course, anybody who believes in God, who really believes in an objective God, is going to say that, because without God there wouldn't be any matter, there wouldn't be any universe. So mind produces matter. That's idealism, basically.
In the personalist variety, like, how does that
well, then you ask what sort of mind. So idealists then split up into various sorts. We all disagree with each other. That's just life. And so some idealists say they're absolute idealists, perhaps like Hegel, or certainly like some of the British idealists. They would just say it's not mind, it's something beyond mind, but it's more like mind than matter. It's mind-like, but it's not personal. So you have an idea of a mind like reality, but it's not concerned with personal interactions with human beings, for example. So it's impersonal. So I think some Buddhists tend to have an idea like that the pure mind school of Buddhism thinks there is something like consciousness or intelligence, even compassion at the heart of the universe, but it doesn't have personal relationships with people. So that's what you're asking then, really. Could you have mind without personal relationships? Well, you could, but that's where Christianity comes in, and it makes the claim that in Jesus, God has personally related in a specific way to human life and history. So, yeah, idealism doesn't get you to a personal God, but it makes it a sort of living possibility.
Mm-hmm. Now, early in the first half of the book, you lay out a number of ways the theological inheritance of Aristotle and Aquinas really problematizes the type of personal idealism, or at least the tradition hearing the personal idealism you're articulating as its own. Maybe you can kind of introduce the foundational assumptions that are going on in the kind of scholastic vision that you're wanting to directly challenge as a Christian and a philosopher.
Yes, well, Aristotle was a very great philosopher. Nobody's going to argue with that. And Aquinas gave a Christian interpretation to Aristotle, and nobody's going to question that was a magnificent intellectual job, and it has founded the basis of the Roman Catholic approach to doctrine ever since, and still does. But it's a very odd view, because Aristotle didn't think that God was a creator. at all. Aristotle thought there was an ultimate mind, but it wasn't interested in the universe. There was mind, but there was also the universe, and the mind hadn't created the universe and wasn't interested in it and didn't know anything about it. And the mind was changeless. It didn't know what was going on, didn't care what was going on. It was just completely isolated, sort of like a COVID god. I mean, he was in self-isolation and wasn't bothered about what was going on. Now, that was Aristotle. Now, the thing is, Aquinas did a magnificent job of trying to turn this Aristotle God into a creator, but I think he just failed. He just didn't manage it. I mean, how can you have a God who creates the world for a purpose, but doesn't care about it and isn't concerned with it and isn't affected by it in any way? And if you look at the Bible, it's almost impossible to feel that this is a God who doesn't care about anything. I mean, as Luther put it, God dies on the cross. Right? Well, even Catholics, in the Thomist tradition, would say God dies on the cross, but they have a very sophisticated way of saying, well, the divine nature doesn't die. It's not affected by the crucifixion, but the human nature of Jesus does die, of course. And I think that's just doublespeak, frankly, that if Jesus is the one you worship as God and Jesus dies, then you're going to have to say this makes a difference to God. It's a different sort of God who in a human form dies on the cross. So that I don't think you can use Aristotle in that way. There are lots of good things in Aristotle, but what is a bad thing in Aristotle is that he thinks God, the ultimate reality, is actually changeless, not affected by anything in the world, and timeless. Doesn't ever do one thing after another. So it's completely impassive, really, and self-concentrated. And I think, well, that's a great idea, but it's not the Christian God.
Yeah. Now, I'm extremely sympathetic to this. So there's a certain revival of sorts among neo-scholasticism.
There is.
And it's also connected in some sense to the way in which one relates to the tradition. And so a lot of, say, like your personalist metaphysics or any type of philosophical theologian doing a speculative engagement that doesn't kind of inherit the tradition and its kind of neo-Thomist tome is just, they don't really know what to do with it and are already problematic on it. And then they'll ask you questions like, well, Tripp, do you really believe in divine simplicity? And you're like, no. And they're like, well, is it Christian? And you're just like, have you read the New Testament? You know, like this is like how it comes. And so I'm interested what kind of advice would you give for introducing the kind of philosophical challenges to things like impassibility, immutability, questions around evil and divine action that you wrestle with in the book? Like, what are the places to begin those where you get heard and there's a conversation?
Well, I think it's actually a close study of Aquinas and a close look at the Roman Catholic tradition, which has accepted Aquinas on the whole, reveals some big cracks in the edifice and some real places where you get a tension between actual living life as a Catholic and what Aquinas says about God. And what I mean by that is, within Catholicism, there's a great mystical tradition of union with God and of being, united to the divine nature. I would start there and say, well, look, if this is true, and of course there is that statement in one of the letters of Peter in the New Testament, that the mystery revealed in Christ, in Jesus, is that we shall share in the divine nature. Okay, so if you accept that, you've got to say, wouldn't that make any difference to God at all? So if you're going to have a doctrine of what in the Eastern churches is called theosis, that is sharing in the divine nature, how can you share in the nature without making any difference to it? I mean, the nature of God, without anybody sharing in it, is very different from the nature of God with somebody sharing it. I mean, it's just an obvious difference. So I think what happens is that people believe in God's simplicity. That is, that God can't be affected by anything else at all. Is all self-complete. They're very interested to say that God is sovereign, is absolutely sovereign. So, and perfect. God is perfect. And it's part of their idea of perfection that God can't change. I mean, if you're perfect, why would you change? You're perfect. And philosophically, the reply to that is, but change is part of perfection. If you try and imagine a perfect life, you don't imagine always doing the same thing or never doing anything new. And I think I would really ask the question, if you think God is powerful, to a Thomist, if you think God is powerful, what do you do about saying God cannot change? There's huge millions of things God can't do. He can't do anything. I mean, whatever he can do, he's doing, but he couldn't do anything else. So the key question is, could God do anything other than he actually does? And I just press a Thomist philosopher to say, well, surely you have to say he couldn't. God couldn't do anything other than God does. So everything becomes necessary. And then you've got a big internal fissure in the Catholic way of doing it, the neo-Thomist way, not necessarily Catholic. That is that a powerful being, a creative being, must change. That's part of what perfection is. So that's, for me, a key question. You try to imagine that God is a being whose existence is as perfect as you can think. Wouldn't that involve things like compassion, creativity, and continual ability to do new things? And I just think that's an insight that Aristotle didn't have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you bring up a number of examples from Scripture, and then talk about how that a particular philosophical system can kind of internalize them. And one that showed up twice was about Moses praying and God actually responding to it. And I think if most people read that story, that Moses sees a situation, has a desire that resonates with presumably God's deep desire within him, prays, and God actually responds, right? And and underneath that is this kind of dynamism, but you kind of emphasize in it how divine immutability kind of deflates the very pathos of the text.
That's true. And the thing is, I think there is a sense, I mean, Thomism is half right. There is a sense in which God is immutable. And a Christian would probably want to say God is immutable in love. God will never stop loving. So God changes in love. But that doesn't mean God can't ever respond to somebody like Moses, right? And in fact, a loving person would respond more than anybody else to people like Moses. So that you just have to distinguish between the immutable bits of God, like love and power and creativity, and the mutable parts where God will express the nature of God in ever new and vital ways. And that's the move that a Thomist doesn't want to make, really. And yet I think in practice they have to make it. When they pray, when they claim to experience God speaking to them or becoming known to them or revealing something to them, these are all active words. And I don't see why you shouldn't have a philosophy which enables you just to say that. So we don't have to agree with Aristotle about everything. I mean, I'm not anti-Catholic at all. I've taught in a Jesuit college for years, but I am anti-using Aristotle as the only philosopher who can give you the Christian faith. In fact, I think it's weird, I'm sorry to say, to do that. Right.
Yeah, you say in the book Part of the problem there is the nature of divine simplicity requires that the one act of creation, right, include what comes across in the biblical text as that God's changing relationship to a creation God loves.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, simplicity is a very difficult notion, but actually, technically, it means there are no parts in God. God is not made up of parts. And that is taken to mean that God's wisdom is the same as God's love, which is the same as God's power. They're not different, because God is only one simple, undivided thing, no parts. And that means that we can't, that everything we say about God, like God is loving or God is wise, is actually not true, because those things point to something in God which is inconceivable by us, because his love is not different from his wisdom. And well, how far do you want to press the inconceivability of God? There's a point at which Thomism comes very near to non-realism, because if you say there is a being which has no distinct properties and can't even be said to exist as a distinct property, you might as well say there isn't a God, because there's nothing you can say about it. Saying there is something about which I can say nothing is actually saying nothing. And that's an argument I try to use continuously against a very old friend of mine and somebody I admire very much, Rowan Williams, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's written some great books, but they have this Thomist flavor. It's because people like him want to stress the mystery of God. And, God is greater than anything we can conceive, but I don't think that means that we don't know anything true about God.
Mm-hmm. My favorite chapter in the book was where you talk about analogy and oxymorons. And I think that really gets at how the problem of religious language in that more classically Thomist framework. So maybe if you could say a bit about analogy, your affirmation of it, but also its limits.
Yeah. Well, and obviously, if you say God is loving, God's love is not going to be exactly like any human being's loving. It doesn't have the sort of passionate changes that a human being would have, but it's a concern for the good of humanity, right? It's a concern for the well-being of created things. And that's just true. I mean, so I would want to say there are some things we say about God, like, for example, God is more powerful than I am. That's a statement about God. And I think it's just true. It's not analogically true, because I'm not describing what God is. It's just true. God is more powerful than I am. And then you can say God is more powerful than any created thing. And yep, that's just true. So you don't need analogy. People who use analogy just want to say, well, God's power is very different from our power. Well, that's true. That's true. But it's not analogically true that God is powerful. It's just literally true. God is more powerful than any created thing. So that's my objection to analogy. It's depriving words of their meaning altogether, really. You say, well, God is love, but not in the way you understand love. Well, okay, but if you say that means God doesn't care for the well-being of creatures. No, that's false. He does. God does care. So that's something literally true. God does care for the well-being of creatures. So, I don't think analogy is helpful. It's very misleading to use. I would never use it.
Yeah, well, and for Thomas, the analogy of being is kind of an essential way of framing
It is
language
essential.
about God.
Yeah.
And you give two examples of, and with your snarky wit sometimes makes me giggle and wonder whether or not you are overstating things just because the joke was so good. But you have a section where you're talking about oxymorons, and you say something like classical theologians are wonderfully gifted at dealing with oxymorons. Jesus used them all the time, in parables and this type of thing. And you go, if they'll say things like the impassable became passable, or the eternal was born, and they'll come up with ways basically where it didn't mean what it just said anyway. And I wonder if you could kind of talk about like contrast how a personalist idealism relates to some of those same statements versus the kind of classical Thomist way of dealing with it.
Yeah. Well, you have the central statement of Christianity that the word became flesh. And a Thomist would have to say that's actually not true, because the word, being divine, is changeless. So the word didn't become anything. So what does that mean then? And you get a very sophisticated account. You say, well, actually, what it means is the human nature of Jesus changed to become united to God. But God didn't change at all in that. So I think that's it's obviously reversing the order of things as they're expressed at the beginning of John's Gospel. The word did become flesh. But you don't want to say the word, the difficulty, what they're against and what they're correctly against is that God changed into a human being. And that would be false. So you've got to find a way of between saying God didn't change at all. I mean, he became flesh, but it didn't make any difference to God. Sounds very odd. And the other thing saying, well, God just changed into flesh. And so, but there is a way between those. And fortunately, we've got plenty of scientific things that we could use to make sense of it. And you say, this human being was a temporal expression of a being which doesn't really have a physical form in itself. So you say God, in God's self, has no physical form. He's not a man, he's not anything finite. But that reality can be expressed correctly, authentically, in a physical form. So that notion of expression or manifestation is the one you could use to say the word became flesh, the word was expressed. And in fact, in one passage from the Bible, it says, well, Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. I mean, that makes the point exactly. God is invisible, but can be expressed in a visible image. To me, that makes perfectly good philosophical sense. It's not an oxymoron. But Christian theologians love to use paradox. So they will say the word became flesh, that God died, whereas you need a slightly more subtle expression. I mean, it's true that the creator of all things cannot die, but God can be expressed in a form which dies. So it's how you pick your words, really, and in the end, a Catholic would probably, and I could get a form for which was agreed. But so what's that disagreement? That's a very interesting question. In practice, there's probably no disagreement. I mean, if I go to Mass and I'm an Anglican, as happens, but if I go to Mass and take the body and blood of Christ and a Catholic does, I think we're doing the same thing. I don't think there's any difference. But we'll give a very different philosophical account of what's going on. The Catholic will talk about transubstantiation, and I'll say, well, I don't know what substance is, and I don't know what we mean by a substance changing its accidents or the accidents remaining the same and the substance changing. That doesn't make sense to me. And then I'll say to the Catholic, but do you have to use Aristotle? This is Aristotle. Do you have to use that? In my experience, most Catholic theologians have said to me, no, we don't have to use Aristotle, but we prefer Aristotle. That's all right by me, I mean, because they're just wrong. I don't mind people being wrong. I'm wrong quite a lot of the time. But it's not any longer a great faith difference. You see what I mean? It's about a philosophical interpretation of what you were doing. And what we're all doing is thinking, how do I relate to the love of God and express it in the world? And that's the important thing. So philosophy is the way of making this most reasonable and coherent to us. So all I'm doing is saying, we're really, Aristotle, great, but he's out of date, really. Matter of fact, I prefer Plato, but I wouldn't take him either, because I think what's happened in the modern world, and it is since the 16th century, really, very definitely since the 16th century, people have come to think that change is good. It's not bad. And in fact, that reality is not some abstract, immaterial thing, but it is this world. But a Christian would add, this world transfigured by the presence of the eternal mind, God, personal reality beyond it. So we're looking for a consistent way to do it. And I just think, well, Aristotle's had his day now, really. It's time to look for somebody else.
You know, one of the other theologians you engage with is David Bentley Hart, who's Orthodox theologian. And he states plainly and emphatically his genuine concern about the type of personalist idealism. And he says that the idea God depends upon creation to be God, and creation exists by necessity because of some lack in God. And then he goes on and says the idea of a God who becomes through suffering passion is simply a metaphysical myth. Like when you say that. Yeah, I find him to be a thinker where half the time I'm like, this is great, and the other half the time I'm like, I'm not sure where the vehement comes from, but
no, that's right. He is Orthodox, but the Orthodox Christians are mostly influenced by Plato. It's a very non-Aristotelian tradition, but it's still ancient Greek, so you still got the problem. Do we want to go along with Plato with a lot of things? And he's as a philosopher, insofar as he's a philosopher, he doesn't like this basically German, Hegelian, post-Kantian emphasis on change and creativity as a good thing. He doesn't want to share that. And that's perhaps because of this Platonic tradition that in Plato too, as well as in Aristotle, the changeless is the best. So you've got a great investment in changelessness, and you think, oh, these Hegelians, they're just modern heretics. All right. So he's inconsistent, actually, in what he writes, because when he says that God is changeless, he actually has a sentence. I can't quote it exactly offhand, but it's in the book. He has a sentence where he says the changelessness of God includes the creative love of Jesus, right? So that sentence, I just think, is an oxymoron. It is a self-contradiction. The changeless can't include the changing. You've got to have a different. So I would accuse. I have great respect for him as a theologian, and I agree with him entirely about that all can be saved and things like that. But I think he is not consistent in his view of the absolute changelessness of God, and that's probably because, as Orthodox, he's as committed to Plato as traditional Catholics are committed to Aristotle, and how to free them from their bonds to these ancient Greeks.
What do you make of the kind of revival of like Neoplatonic theory of participation that's going on? Because I guess it depends on who it is when I read it, but I feel like the Neoplatonic kind of participation revival has elements of it that are more inclusive of open style thinking, and then others that are doing the same type of recapitulation of the original version to avoid change.
Yeah. Of course, in Plato, I mean, the most absurd sentence in the whole of Plato is a sentence in his dialogue, The Republic, where he says that real things are universals. They're like bedness is more real than actual physical beds, right? So I just ask what he lies on at nights, really, because that's to me an absurd statement. But that's where ultra-Platonism leads you. So humanity is more real than individual human beings. And I think what happened in this, again, post-16th century philosophy was people began to think individuals, particulars, are more real than universals. So individual human beings like you and me are more real than some abstract, the word abstract is important, of course, some abstract idea of humanity. So the Platonic, ultra-Platonic move is to say, well, the ideas of humanity and truth and goodness and beauty, you get this in Augustine very much. Beauty is more important than particular beautiful things. And Augustine has a passage where he says you should ascend beyond being attracted to particular beauties to contemplate beauty itself. Well, that's a Platonic move to ultra-Platonism. Beauty itself is what you contemplate. Well, I just don't think philosophically that holds water, and that you contemplate beauty simply by looking at particular beautiful things. And beauty is an abstract term for all those sorts of things. So that's the modern move, really, in philosophy, post-16th century. It's the move from the ultimate reality of universals, and of course the termist God is a universal. It's the ultimate universal being, just pure being, and particulars. So particulars have a reality which is of ultimate decisive importance, and they can't be reduced or collapsed or absorbed into universals. And of course, that gave rise to materialism, the view that there is nothing but particulars. And I think what the theist wants is to say particulars are the important thing, but the particulars show something behind them, not something changeless, but some creative, dynamic reality which makes them important. That's the decisive move for me, the move from the universal to the particular, and from the eternal to the temporal.
And I think part of it is a return to participation in a world that has this type of flattening materialism in it. Is really an affirmation of this depth dimension that our experiences are saying is there, and our kind of bifurcated account of nature and philosophy doesn't ring for. But I do think that in most Platonism, the eternal forms or the mind of God, if that is changeless, then it doesn't capture the real, of fluctuating creativity of divine valuation. And
exactly.
But when the participation image is reciprocal between God and the world, then the divine mind can always be valuating the world in its becoming without the values having to be abstract and eternal, and in some sense necessarily dematerialized.
Yeah, absolutely. But in Plato himself, and of course, he wasn't a Platonist. He had lots of dialogues, all of which say different things. But two main things he does say are, first of all, there's the world of forms, ideas, eidos. It's the ideas are changeless and eternal, so they're changeless. But there's also this thing he calls the demiurge, the architect, the world architect. And that is a mind, a divine mind, which takes the forms and uses them as models for reality. You get that in his dialogue called the Timaeus. So although Plato didn't believe in one God, he did believe, or he talked about anyway, a divine architect using eternal ideas as models for particulars. And that's a much more positive account of particulars. He says, for example, in the Timaeus, the world is the moving image of eternity. That's a moving image. So there's something important about that. Okay, so there's a sort of Platonism which says, leave the world, get to the absolute universals, and that's the important thing. That's ultra-Platonism. But there's also a sort of Platonism which says, no, the world is the image of a reality which is held in the divine mind, which uses the models of beauty and truth to be expressed in particulars. And that's a Platonic, it's in Plato, but it's a very Christian view. It translates well into a Christian view that in God there are the ideas of everything that could be, and God intentionally makes some of them physically real. And the physical reality, of course, makes a difference. And so, yeah, as you put it, I mean, the participation is mutual. God participates in time, and temporal things can participate in God. So I like participation, but in your sense, in mutual participation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, it reminds me of that essay in Adventure of Ideas where Whitehead kind of does his thoughts on the possible future of religion and says, it's called the New Reformation. And he says, well, the three big ideas that the West has yet to integrate is the first one was Platonic picture of participation, then was its demonstration in the person of Jesus, and then it's the mutual indwelling within the Trinity. And he said that the New Reformation that he could look towards is one where the nature of participation within the divine life is brought down to the nature of God-world relation in that you see in the person of Jesus. And I thought, in a sense, if your framing of the personalist idealism of God was in Christ reconciling the world is a way of saying, how do we do some type of creative engagement that includes these three elements that usually a philosopher that's a religious person picks two of the three.
Yeah, that's right. And I think Whitehead, of course, was a part Platonist. He had the world of divine ideas, but he was also somebody who made creativity and creative change essential. And that's the reformation of Platonism, which perhaps it does point to a better future, philosophically speaking.
Since being in Scotland, I've engaged a lot more in explicit religion science dialogue. And one of the things that strikes me are that there are four particular topics that oftentimes either get neglected, just told we don't talk about, or all this kind of stuff that seem to me begging a more robust metaphysical picture than normally gets acknowledged. And that's the origin of our particular space-time, the origin of life, mind, how you even explain mind and consciousness, and values. And that, if you imagine thinking you've given the most thorough account, rigorous account of truth seeking, and you have zero to say about mind, life, the origin of the cosmos, and value. It just seems that you've already taken nature and then cut it in half and said, well, we got this book of nature, we're going to abridge it. And the only parts of nature we talk about are the things we can get in a hydrogen, we can put in a collider, we can put under a microscope, we can dissect, only primary qualities, not secondary ones. Only this type of bifurcation of nature, I think, is then assumed by so much theology that you get a religion science dialogue where we're debating particular interpretation or trying to come up with something when really it's the metaphysical deficiency of the whole thing is what keeps coming to my mind.
I think science is changing very rapidly, and it's very diverse. There's no one thing you can say about it. But people like Roger Penrose, who is responsible with Stephen Hawking for developing the black holes theory, Stephen Hawking says, actually, future physics will have to include consciousness. It can't any longer think of the universe as unaffected by our observations of it or by our interactions with it. And even in carrying out experiments, we interact with nature and change things from what they would otherwise be. And in quantum physics, this is very clear. And there's the Feynman experiments which show that the nature of whether electrons appear as particles or as waves depend upon the sort of interference which you have with them in observation. Now, nobody understands quantum physics very well in its ultimate meaning, but everybody who knows about quantum physics would say, actually, it looks as though consciousness is necessary to understand what ultimately happens in the physical world. So I think the gaps that you mentioned between a purely physicalist account of science and the world of values and purposes is, pretty much closing. And even people who don't agree with that would have to admit there are phenomena in quantum physics which make them wary of saying, oh, well, we can understand the world without understanding consciousness. And that's a huge breakthrough, in fact. For people who want to look this up a bit, it's called the Bell theorem. If you look just on Wikipedia or something, look up Bell theorem. And it shows you the way in which lots of modern scientists are actually convinced that consciousness needs to be somehow, we can't do it yet, put into our statements, at least in physics, if in nothing else. And that's an interesting way of thinking.
The different generations of the religion science conversation have had sometimes different sciences as their primary conversation partner.
That's right.
And then also a different kind of background understanding as to the task of the interpreter. So some you'll have a debate about how you see the two relating, and like, oh, is it a conflict model, integrationist model, or these type of things, or non-overlapping magisteria or whatever, and then you're trying to build a system that connects it, and then all the way on the other end, you could have religion science, and it's like the way in which cognitive mechanisms function within a religious tradition in a ritual setting, right? And that science is helping understand this, but it doesn't have any traction about what it means on ultimately. And like, how do you see those two kind of different methodologies being integrated, or is that type of integration possible?
Well, if you're a car mechanic, you don't have to ask ultimate questions about the nature of the universe, right? Mm-hmm. And in the same way, if you're a working scientist, you don't have to ask these questions. I mean, I know quantum physicists here in Oxford, where I am, who say, don't ask those sorts of questions, just do the math. Do the math. That's what you do. So physics doesn't of itself raise those questions. It's like car mechanics. You carry on the stuff from where you start and solve problems in the discipline itself. So you have to move outside physics to ask questions about what physics tells you about reality. Some physicists do that and some don't. But I think the ones who do move outside are the ones who are more liable to say it's probably not true that physics or chemistry or biology tells you everything about the nature of reality. They're very specific and different disciplines. It tells you about bits of reality, but there's no way in which they can cover everything. But then you're moving outside. The question: what does physics tell you? Is everything that you can know given to you by some natural science? That question is not a scientific question. So even to ask the question throws you into the world of philosophy. And of course, some scientists are not interested in that world, or then they don't like to make moves in that world. And they're the ones who are more tempted to be reductionists and say, oh, well, let's just stick say physics tells you the truth. I'm not interested in other things too. But physicists are people, and some of them are religious and some aren't. And I think that's what it comes down to. It's not from the physics. I mean, Crick was notorious for being an atheist long before he was a biologist. So you take your beliefs with you, and of course, you just try and make your beliefs consistent with what you're discovering. Well, there's no question that Christian physicists can do that. So there's no war between science and religion, because it's just a question of how you integrate the different aspects of your experience and whether you're interested in doing that at all. Mm-hmm. So I think the greatest physicist of all time was certainly a committed believer in God and in Christ, and that was Isaac Newton. So it's obviously possible. There isn't a standing dispute between them. It depends. Obviously, if you're an atheist, you're not going to want to say that your physics depends on God, and it doesn't. Your car mechanics doesn't depend on God. Why should it?
So one of the other questions that came up in the book was your discussion around divine action, and one of the ways the larger classical Thomist side of things talks is a kind of a resurgence of discussing non-competitive divine action, in which in which they talk about the different types of causation. And I've had this conversation with a number of people that have articulated it, and I don't understand how ultimately that the Thomist opinion doesn't lead you to kind of necessarily be a hard determinist, because but they always use the language in some way to get to respond to me as if they are affirming a type of freedom and such, but also it couldn't have really been otherwise, and the primary cause is always the divine mind, and the divine mind doesn't change and it's eternal. And I don't know what I'm missing when I get in those conversations.
Well, of course, I think Thomism is committed to being completely predestinarian. But there is a form of Christianity which is completely predestinarian. I mean, John Calvin and Luther too were probably completely predestinarian. That is to say, God has made everything past and present and future to be what it is, and God's done that. It's the total sovereignty of God. So that's a big item of Christian belief, and people like me just have to say, we don't accept that. We don't think that's true. The biblical account doesn't force you into that position. God has determined everything in advance. So it is a proper theological dispute. So I think all you can say there is, well, there is this Christian tradition and that would suit a Thomist, of course, because how can it be predestinarian? Well, if God is beyond time altogether and creates it, then you've got this changeless God. So, yeah, I mean, I have to say that's a widely held Christian position. But again, it comes down to, are you a predestinarian? And you're into a different area there. That's a different sort of discussion. But I'm certainly a believer in freedom, which is not caused or determined fully by anything else, not even by God. So that's called in England a libertarian, though I think in the United States the word libertarian might have a different meaning. I know it does for some people. You can carry as many guns as you like. But anyway, I'm a libertarian that in the sense that I think even God doesn't totally determine such that it couldn't be otherwise what human beings do. Mm-hmm. So there's a freedom of creativity. Again, that's just a deep philosophical dispute, and there's no way of conclusively resolving it.
But the type of freedom you're advocating isn't libertarian in the sense of all possibilities are available to you. But
no. Just that sometimes there are some possibilities available to you. Yes. Mm-hmm. Very limited. Yeah, it's very limited. indeed. I can't fly out the window, or I can't get to you physically, but I can raise my arm. Little things like that. So limited freedom. Yeah, I don't see why not. Again, that's another philosophical issue, but I think there's no reason at all to support determinism, and I think it's a very implausible theory that everything that ever happens could never have happened otherwise. It means the world is not really contingent, which contradicts another Thomist doctrine, of course, because the world is supposed to be contingent, and yet everything in it is determined by God. And God is simple and God is necessary. That's another difficulty. Getting into all these philosophical difficulties, afraid trip. Every problem in philosophy leads to every other problem. It never ends. I mean, it's lovely, really, if you like problems.
Well, I think you know how to find them.
Yeah, I think that's my final message, really, in a way, which is that nobody can be certain of anything. So you commit yourself to the best thing that you know.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to be happy with that.
So what is the last book currently that you're working on?
Oh, this one. It's change of direction, really. It's about the parables of Jesus. So anyway, it is what it is. Because I think, well, I'm a Christian. The Jesus parables are the best recorded memories of what Jesus said. So it's quite important to see what they're saying. And of course, I've got a very inflated view of what they're saying. It's about a cosmic view of all things participating in God, which doesn't immediately strike people as obvious. If you're talking about people sowing seeds in fields. But anyway, so that's what the book's about. Mm-hmm. It's a great book, I think. But tomorrow I won't think that anymore.
I've really been enjoying getting to catch up and talk to you.